Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Jeff Laurenti, the chairman of the Coalition for Peace Action. Yes. And want to welcome you to our 46th annual Conference for Peace. Looking around this room, I see some faces who were there back in 1980, 1982, with the heyday of the nuclear freeze movement, when voters actually felt passion about these issues and concern. And I see faces, Zia Mian's freshmen against the wall here, who are very new to this issue. And we are hoping that in the next few years, we may be able to make sufficient progress with all of your help that you are not fighting this battle 50 years from now. Yes. Yes, that would be great. This has been a year of unexpected turnings of the wheel, of thoughts that had been previously considered unthinkable becoming policy. And nowhere more so than in the area of nuclear arms control and the still much sought after abolition of such weapons, their elimination from our arsenals. We have only in the past few weeks heard a president tell us that he was ordering a return of nuclear testing. A little bit of ambiguity about what exactly he meant, since he is not known for precision on detail, but enough to be of concern that he said what he actually may have meant, which would mean undoing what has been one of the major accomplishments of the post-Cold War era, an elimination of all testing of nuclear weapons. That for 37 years, I think, has effectively been the case. And to reopen that Pandora's box would surely be a source of evil and of a nuclear arms race and all its dangers that we had not even known in the heyday of the Cold War period. So it's important that you be here with us, that we are all here together to learn what the status is today, what the opportunities are, even when the clouds seem darkest and the gale winds the most howling, for being able to once again put ourselves on the road that President Obama, following improbably President Reagan, following President Carter, following John F. Kennedy, seeing a world free of nuclear weapons once again. Our keynote speaker to lead off a discussion that we will have this afternoon is Alexandra Bell. Now, her bio is in the program, so I don't need to repeat that. It is important to repeat that she's president and CEO of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Tick tock, think doomsday clock. But she had also been in important positions in policymaking in the space of nuclear nonproliferation, arms reductions, and again, our hope for ultimate elimination in both the Obama administration, where some tangible progress was made, and in the, if we still remember it, the Biden administration. And I will leave to Alex telling us where we are today and where we go from here.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. My thanks to Reverend Moore, Jeff, and to the Coalition for Peace Action for having me here today. I will start out by relating to you that I have been at this work for about 36 years, which may seem like a lot, but I assure you that it is true. In 1989, I had been planning to be a zoologist, and I was terribly upset about the Exxon Valdez oil spill. My parents had no idea what to do with my 9-year-old righteous anger, and they suggested that I write President George H.W. Bush. I did write a very earnest letter about my concern, And some months later, I got a letter back that said, "Thanks for your letter. Keep reading books." And I was like, this is unacceptable. So pretty much radicalized from that age. And it was only 2 years later I led my first protest at my middle school because they were doing cuts to the school library. It was years later that my father pointed out to me that in my letter to the president, and he transcribed a copy, I accused the president of spending too much time focusing on industry and nuclear weapons. So apparently it was there the whole time, and led me to where I am now. And I'll admit, we're not in a good place. We're 80 years into the nuclear age. There has been no shortage of treatises on what anniversaries mean, what this anniversary means. Indeed, other experts and I have followed the general anniversary format for years now, reviewing the history of nuclear buildups and drawdowns, of ludicrous suppositions about nuclear weapons, of near fatal escapes from nuclear crises and miscalculations, and then carefully arranging earnest calls to action to reduce the nuclear threat. I will admit, I think something about this anniversary feels different. 8 decades since the Trinity test and the first use of atomic weapons, the only use of atomic weapons in war, we now find ourselves in an inflection point. The rising tide of nuclear challenges threatens to topple over what remains of our poorly tended metaphorical levees. The choices in the months and years ahead will determine our fate. The future, our future, is on the line. As noted, I took over as the president and CEO of the Bulletin this past January. Since taking on that role, I've spent much time combing through the archives, starting at the very beginning. And on page 1 of the first issue of the Bulletin, the newly formed atomic scientists of Chicago implored the public to see the danger at hand. They warned that, quote, gains in wealth, economic security, or improved health would be useless if our nation is to live in continuous dread of sudden annihilation, end quote. Perhaps unexpectedly, we did find a way to prosper under the ever-present shadow of nuclear war. While the threat of sudden annihilation remains, the continuous dread is now largely relegated to the few of us who spend our lives contemplating and attempting to forestall doomsday. It would be hard to explain to Einstein, Oppenheimer, or virtually anyone alive in 45 that the fearsome reality of a world awash in nuclear weapons would in the future often be nothing more than background noise. They would likely be stunned to know that the world had been lulled into nuclear apathy by its own success in avoiding annihilation, without much thought to the possibility that that success was underpinned by sheer dumb luck. Of course, the truism that all luck eventually runs out does not resonate with everyone working to manage nuclear threats. Over the course of my career, I have heard some statements about the nuclear threats that literally made my jaw drop. I recall a defense expert lamenting, quote, people think nukes are worse than they are, end quote, as if they aren't the most comprehensive killing machine ever created by man. I still think about a former congressional staffer wearily quipping that, quote, it is a fantasy and a waste of time to think that we can make any progress, end quote, on arms control, as if we had the luxury to quit trying. I certainly cannot forget a colleague explaining that, quote, we don't want to seem desperate or plaintive about arms control, as if an arms race didn't come with its own foul scent of desperation. Resonating the loudest is the refrain from a counterpart confidently stating that, quote, US-Russia arms control is dead forever, as if either country could afford to ignore the nuclear threat they pose to each other. These statements have counterpoints on the other end of the ideological spectrum that in some ways are just as troubling. I have marveled when an academic said the US allies had, quote, nothing to fear from China, as if Beijing's rapid and opaque nuclear buildup was a benign undertaking. A disarmament advocate dismissed my concerns about effective verification by saying the International Atomic Energy Agency will, quote, figure it out, as if the IAEA had the necessary resources or legal mandate to determine with certainty whether all countries had rid themselves of nuclear weapons and delivery systems. In defense of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, I have heard one proponent say that, quote, they never expected a nuclear weapon state to join, which, if true, would make that treaty an impediment to actual progress towards disarmament. An activist once scolded me, saying the nuclear problem would be solved if simply the United States unilaterally disarmed, as if there were any empirical support for the contention that other nuclear-armed states would simply follow along. So here we collectively find ourselves in the 80th year of the nuclear age, with every nuclear challenge trending in the wrong direction and a discourse that is at best caustic and at worst separated from reality itself. With 89 seconds left on the doomsday clock, it is past time to ask ourselves some serious questions. So how did we get here? Endless navel-gazing, cherry-picked historical anecdotes, and finger-pointing have long plagued the nuclear weapons debate. But at this juncture, a little reflection on how we got to this point is not only helpful, it's necessary. Following the first test at Trinity, Manhattan Project scientists, including those who founded the Bulletin, began to raise alarms about the dangers of nuclear weapons and their proliferation. Those alarms went unheeded, and by 1949, the Soviets acquired their own nuclear capability. By the mid-1960s, the Brits, the Chinese, and the French had joined the nuclear club, and the world braced for the reality of dozens more nuclear-armed states. Sense, or the fear of nuclear annihilation aided by near disasters like the Cuban Missile Crisis, eventually prevailed. Starting in 1970, through accession to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, most countries in the world agreed we should seek another path. While the nuanced interpretations of what the NPT does and does not obligate countries to do could fill the UN General Assembly Hall, the general interpretation has the treaty essentially mandating three things. Countries with nuclear weapons, at the time that was China, France, Soviet Union, US, and UK, committed to good faith efforts to reduce their stockpiles with the eventual goal of general and complete disarmament. Countries without nuclear weapons committed to not pursuing them, and then all treaty members in good standing would have access to civil nuclear technology. Though imperfect, and let me be clear, all arms control agreements are imperfect, the treaty prevented mass proliferation once feared and kept pressure on countries with nuclear weapons, particularly the Soviet Union, then Russia, and the United States to restrict and reduce their arsenals through a series of treaties and other legally binding agreements. Throughout these years, public involvement was essential to progress, necessary for progress. Millions of people marched in the streets around the world, demanding their leaders work to reduce nuclear threats. Thousands of people devoted their careers to meeting those demands. The NPT's indefinite extension in '95, achieved through myriad further commitments to reducing nuclear risks, seemed like a full validation of the path away from nuclear weapons. 30 years later, that consensus is now buried under rampant distrust and broken or unkept promises. Treaties were abandoned or violated. Disarmament bodies became frustratingly deadlocked. Models of stability were undermined, and the public turned its attention to other risks. But nuclear threats do not manage themselves or diminish from lack of attention. Many in the nuclear community now say we are at the start of a third nuclear age, the first age running from 45 to roughly 91, marked by discovery, nuclear proliferation and buildups, and the near daily fear of nuclear war. The second age, running until roughly now, marked by massive arms reductions, two distinct proliferation challenges in the form of North Korea and Iran, and the fear of nuclear terrorism. This third age, some are quick to predict, will be marked by an arms buildup, hastened by a burgeoning arms race, driven by the off-referenced and poorly defined great power competition. One could posit that it is a bit premature, if not cavalier, to predict how an entire age will unfold. That said, it is impossible to argue that the trajectory is unchanged, that nuclear threats are not on the rise. So what do we want now? The exploration of the power of the atom may have rendered the creation of nuclear weapons inevitable, but no one actually asked the citizens of the world if they would like to create and sustain a security structure predicated on the complete and total annihilation of humankind. If they had been asked, it is likely they would have preferred another option. In fact, the majority of countries on this planet have now acceded to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a treaty that seeks to ban the use and possession of nuclear weapons. For almost all of those countries, the TPNW is the third iteration of that commitment to a nuclear-free world, the other two being the NPT and several regional nuclear weapons free zone treaties. Those commitments indicate widespread support for continuing disarmament work of the last half century. However, the majority of humans on this planet live in a country that has nuclear weapons or is covered by a nuclear umbrella. In assessing their security needs, these countries all see the need for deterrence that nuclear weapons in theory provide, and for some, even the need for more nuclear weapons. The keys to moving forward to a safer world is knowing whether the latter group remains committed to the ultimate goal of a world without nuclear weapons, and if every country is willing to do the difficult work to reach that goal. Those who do not think the end goal of a world without nuclear weapons is the right one for global security should make that case out loud in public without euphemisms or what Carol Cohn once described as techno-strategic jargon. Those who support disarmament but are not willing to take on the potential political or economic burdens that would likely accompany that pursuit should also be truthful about their level of commitment. With overt and abject honesty, at least then those arguing over the future of nuclear weapons will understand the contours and the nature of the debate and prepare accordingly. So what will the future hold? With all the cards on the table, reinvigorated discourse on the future of nonproliferation, arms control and deterrence, and disarmament would be the next logical step. Of course, current discourse on these issues is siloed or combative, so the task at hand will be to find a way to start talking with each other again, not past each other or at each other or behind each other's backs. Perspectives on nuclear risk vary widely depending on the circumstance. Despite their current scarce supply, empathy and understanding will be needed if all sides are to progress on reducing nuclear risks. With a more vigorous conversation underway, the process of finding common ground could begin. Given that a common long-term consensus about the future of nuclear weapons will take time and effort to forge, the short-term common goal should be the prevention of nuclear war. Then one must ask if the system of controls we have created to prevent nuclear war is actually fit for purpose anymore. Here, I think you would find a point of agreement. No one who thinks very deeply about the current system thinks that current system is working well. On nonproliferation, by and large, nonproliferation is held, with only 9 states in possession of nuclear arsenals, but that norm is fading each day. In the past, countries considering the potential acquisition of nuclear weapons would do so in secret. Now experts and leaders in countries like Poland, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Turkey, and even Japan openly discuss and debate going nuclear. Going forward, countries must discuss the factors that are driving others to consider the nuclear option, work to mitigate or alter those factors, and work to strengthen the safeguards and structures that impede progress towards the bomb. Those safeguards and structures may be complex and expensive to maintain, but they do serve a greater good. The likelihood of nuclear war goes up each time a new state builds a nuclear weapon. There are no exceptions to that reality, even if some bandy about the idea of, quote, friendly proliferation by U.S. allies, among the truest examples of an oxymoron I have ever encountered. New strains of embattled nonproliferation infrastructure may cause the nuclear threat landscape to further deteriorate. Many think that nuclear energy can be a bridge to a cleaner environment and a source for the huge electricity demands of artificial intelligence. That may well be the case, but as India, Pakistan, and North Korea have shown, a civil nuclear capacity can be a nuclear weapons starter kit. To limit proliferation, a massive expansion of civil nuclear technology will require more resources and more support for the nonproliferation infrastructure, and a broad conversation about the importance of investing in proliferation-resistant technologies. On arms control, as efforts to restrain nuclear weapons proliferation continue, the set of tools that collectively make up the concept of arms control should be used to manage the existing nuclear weapons. Arms control options include unilateral and parallel transparency and confidence building measures, bilateral and multilateral dialogues, scientific exchanges and cooperation, political agreements, and of course, legally binding agreements. These tools have been used to great effect over the past 80 years, bringing the numbers of nuclear weapons down from the absolutely ludicrous 70,000 to the extremely roughly dangerous amount of 13,000 today. But countries need to acknowledge that not every tool is applicable for every circumstance. And again, no such thing as a perfect arms control measure. After all, arms control measures are not intended to be permanent solutions. They are a way to buy time to ultimately change behavior to reduce the threat of nuclear war. Measures will weaken and erode over time if not properly tended, and sometimes the changing circumstances will mean arms control measures no longer function as designed. But that is not an indication that the tools themselves lack value. Some national security officials and advisors caution against something I've heard a lot, arms control for arms control's sake. But it is difficult to identify one instance in which anything of the sort has ever actually happened. Those who do not think an arms control measure is possible or necessary should be direct about their reasoning, saving everyone time and reducing friction. For the short-term goal of preventing nuclear war, countries can pursue a variety of efforts, including increased transparency about and monitoring of nuclear arsenals, as well as enhanced arrangements for communications during crises. As part of that process, nuclear-armed states must engage in dialogues about their respective mutual deterrence postures and doctrines. Misunderstanding and misperceptions about intentions will only increase the chance of a nuclear catastrophe. Now on deterrence. Effective policies will require a radically expanded debate that includes academic, political, and community leaders. The scholarship around deterrence theory and practice has ossified over the years. Some who believe in the effectiveness of nuclear deterrence have drawn into a closed circle, portraying their views as representative of a broad public consensus and dismissing any critiques as naive or uneducated. On the other side of the debate, some call for the wholesale rejection of deterrence, summarily dismissing any role it might have played in maintaining stability and security over the nuclear age. As long as countries possess nuclear weapons, it would be useful to build a real consensus on how we manage stability and prevent nuclear use. Such a consensus would likely require a return to basics. What is deterrence? What is it for? What would it actually mean if deterrence fails? How will deterrence work with multiple adversaries and in a three-way competition? How many missiles will ever be enough? And with renewed U.S. interest in homeland missile defense, a scientifically sound review of any potential new investments, as well as a refresher on the relationship between offensive and defensive weapon systems, would not only be timely, they would be essential. In that vein, we must also explore whether deterrence policies are unduly influenced by a military-industrial complex that stands to gain financially from arms racing. A real consensus on managing the nuclear threat must include the human factor. Do the autocratic leanings of many of the men who now possess the power to start a nuclear war affect their likelihood to do so? Do we have a good idea of how these men would respond to pressure and potential escalation? And will they act calmly and be guided by rational and scientifically sound advice, or will they be driven by paranoia and their desire for power? And most importantly, we need to truly debate whether any single individual should ever have the power to start a nuclear war. There are uncomfortable but central questions that have been avoided for a long time as well due to political sensitivities. Are China and the United States mutually vulnerable in terms of a nuclear attack? Should North Korea still be treated like a proliferation problem now that it has an established nuclear arsenal and a growing set of delivery systems? Is the world even capable of moving away from a security structure based on mutually assured destruction? At the core of their deterrence discussions, countries will need to acknowledge that deterrence is not an end in itself, but as with arms control, a measure to buy time to change behavior. Arms control and deterrence are, in fact, mutually reinforcing. Both, at the moment, are necessary for global security, at least until there's a consensus that we no longer need or want nuclear arsenals on the planet. On disarmament, while working toward a broader discussion of deterrence, the world must also consider the future of disarmament efforts. This topic requires a more rigorous debate than now exists. Why did the post-Cold War push for a world without nuclear weapons fail? Was it lack of political will or urgency, resistant from those with vested interests in the status quo, or a disbelief in the idea that the goal was achievable? Is it possible to better frame the pursuit of nuclear disarmament, not as an unachievable fantasy, but as a legitimate security proposal? Is a world without nuclear weapons a safer world, or is it one that we have simply replaced nuclear weapons with a different but equally dangerous weapon? How will global security be managed in a world without nuclear weapons, and what can disincentivize conventional war in the absence of nuclear deterrence? Can we ensure that upon reaching zero, the state of disarmament is irreversible? Some of these questions are being debated, but not by nearly enough people and not from nearly enough perspectives. Many disarmament structures created with the best intent long ago ceased to function. Many of these structures, including the largely moribund Conference on Disarmament, were created through 3 UN special sessions on disarmament held from the late 70s to the late 1980s. Some observers have posited that after more than 30 years, it's time for another such session to adapt and repurpose what was built. There is resistance to such an effort, with many experts positing that there is no chance of improving conditions in the international discourse on nuclear threats, and a high likelihood of making things worse. At the same time, the fear of failure, the fear of losing what was built before, could be our undoing. While it will take time, and likely inordinate amounts of patience, to build a new global consensus, the reality is that the only true way to prevent nuclear war is to eliminate nuclear weapons once and for all. Of course, there is no shortcut to a world without nuclear weapons, and no grand bargain on global nuclear disarmament in the offing. The academics, experts, and policies that will undertake the nonproliferation, arms control, deterrence, and disarmament work of this new nuclear age will face obstacles in every direction and new and unprecedented challenges. They will need to understand how other existential risks, climate change, and emerging and disruptive technologies that include synthetic biology and artificial intelligence, among others, will affect their work for good and for bad. They will need to push against status quo thinking, given that is the exact kind of thinking that created the current dangers we're currently managing. They must accept that progress will only be achieved through plotting, frustrating, and iterative steps underpinned by scientific endeavor and sustained political will, some of which can be easily controlled, some of which cannot. Ladies and gentlemen, the clock is ticking, but we still have time. Among the more important lessons learned over the past 80 years is a straightforward one. Nothing is certain, but nothing is preordained either. Humankind is capable of its own destruction and its own salvation. None of the aforementioned questions will be easy to answer, nor would the suggested efforts be easy to implement. But difficulty is not an excuse for inaction. Albert Einstein gave a speech in 1948 that was printed in the Bulletin. In it, he lamented that people were aware of the nuclear threat, the threat of nuclear war, but that, quote, only a few act accordingly. At the dawn of this nuclear age, only a few are aware of the danger that surrounds them each and every day. That is why we must continue to engage in a civil and scientifically sound debate on the ethical, military, political, and scientific aspects of the global nuclear threats facing us and their potential solutions, and then implement those solutions. Make no mistake, we have no time to spare, and now is the time to act accordingly. Now is the time to fight against midnight. Thank you.
So we have 3 speakers, and we've given each of the speakers a total of about 1 hour for their presentation, which should be a maximum of 45 minutes. Alex was below that, which is great. That left us a little more time for the Q&A, but then the rest of the time of the hour is for the Q&A. So it's my honor to introduce the next speaker that we're going to have, Dr. Joseph Gerson. So
I guess one of the first things I want to say, I want to talk mostly over here. You know, there's a lot of us with gray hair. I'll repeat some of what you already know. But the reality is that those of us with gray hair don't have the energy or the drive that young people have. And you know, I remember when I was in high school and the old folks would come by and lecture us, and they would say, you know, the future's in your hands. I sit there and, oh, what crap. And, but the reality is that it is very true. So just a couple other things. I want to do away with a kind of a misunderstanding. While the last time nuclear weapons were used against humans in an explosive test in war, or not test, but explosive attack, was Nagasaki. But the reality is that nuclear weapons have been used over and over and over again, essentially practicing nuclear blackmail over the last now 80 years. We see the Russians doing it in Ukraine, playing nuclear blackmail. But they learned that practice and that lesson from the United States, who, among other things, made those kind of threats in the run-ups to both of the Iraq wars. And two of my books focus on that history. Yeah, and so as I start, I want to say that you probably don't know that Reverend Bob is a bit of a gambler. And so after he invited me, he didn't tell me what I was supposed to speak about. So you're going to get what came out of the hat. I want to start by saying that, I still have Dylan in my head. Let's not talk falsely now. The hour is getting late. The hour is late. And I go back to Antonio Gramsci, who told us that the old world is dying, the new one is trying to be born, and this is a time of monsters. And this is indeed a time of monsters. I'll do my best in the course of my talk to name and shame some of those monsters and to offer a little bit of hope. My thought was to hit several themes, because among other things, nuclear weapons and nuclear danger takes place in larger political contexts. And we need to understand that. And I would argue that the shortest distance between 2 points is not always a straight line. How to move toward nuclear disarmament, nuclear reductions, risk reduction takes us in a number of different directions. So the six, you can see here what the six themes are. I'll talk about news is what your friends tell you, nuclear dangers. So basically, I want to talk about news is what your friends tell you, about nuclear dangers, about the new Cold War with China, and I'm afraid I'm going to get a little bit wonky there, but be patient with me. I want to talk about the stupids being in charge, about confronting the counter-revolution that's underway, and again, some thoughts about some way out of here. So anyhow, as I was preparing my talk, I found myself remembering a conversation I had with one of Martin Luther King's senior aides on the eve of the Poor People's Campaign back in 1968. This was after King had been stymied when he went north in Chicago, and it was a time when Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X were challenging his leadership. And as they're preparing this major campaign, there was no legislative handle which they could press for winning. And so I asked the campaign how the campaign could succeed without a legislative handle. And he told me, when your team is behind, it's the bottom of the ninth inning, and there's 2 outs, and you're at bat, you give it all that you have. And I'm afraid to say this is about where we are at the moment, both nationally and internationally. But we can also take hope from the No Kings demonstrations, which maybe don't go deep enough in terms of policy, but which provide mobilization toward one way out of here. And also the campaigns to protect innocent immigrants who are being rounded up by masked Gestapo figures. I also know from experience that Margaret Mead was right when she said, she wrote, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. We learned this from college students who sat in at a Woolworth drugstore lunch counter, and that's how the nuclear weapons freeze movement that in part brought 1 million people to New York got started. So let me move to news is what your friends tell you. Another lesson I took from the Poor People's Campaign came in a speech by the Reverend James Bevel. News, he said, is what your friends tell you. So 2 weeks ago, I was in Spain for meetings of the International Peace Bureau with peace movement leaders from the United States, Europe, the Global South. And it was, truth to tell, it was healing to be outside of this country for at least a little while. Spaniards and our international allies have sympathy for us as we press against the impending dictatorship. From banners hanging from people's apartment windows to reports of Spain's partial embargo on weapons sales to Israel and graffiti on so many walls, Spanish support for Palestine rights in opposition to Israeli genocide and apartheid were inspiring. IPB leaders from South Africa to South Korea oppose Putin's invasion of Ukraine and support a ceasefire and peace negotiations. Yet across Europe, I have to tell you, there is fear of what Putin's ambitions may be, and those fears are driving a massive European campaign of remilitarization, both within and independent of NATO. The old order is passed, and with 3.5 or 5% military spending of GDP, depending on how you count it, the envisioned warfare states signal an end to the welfare states. That, in turn, will dictate economic pain and provide openings for hard-right forces who are already on the march across Europe. A continent-wide coalition called Stop Euro Arms is mobilizing to resist those spending increases. There's also some question of whether they'll really follow through on their commitments, wondering how long Trump will be at the helm. There was also actually more outrage within peace movement circles at Trump's smash and grab imperial ambitions from Venezuela to Greenland and Gaza to Panama. I've long been critical of Maduro's dictatorship, but how do you find meaningful words to a Venezuelan you're with, whose family lies in the balance? How do you do more than just say we're going to do our best to prevent a war? Words that are almost, I'm afraid to say, almost meaningless. But I did get a lot of smiles and thumbs up for the Canada is not for sale hat that I was wearing. People loved it. I've got it here, but I'm not going to go down to it. Returning to Reverend Bevel's reference to News and Friends, shortly before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, I was surprised to be invited to a confidential Track 2 process with former senior Russian, European, and U.S. arms control diplomats, generals and analysts. You remember Sesame Street, which one of these is not like the other? It's me. But I've learned a lot from these people whose first assumptions differ so much from mine. Yeah, after Trump's election, senior Russians asked how deeply the change would be in the United States. Would they be equal to the Civil War, to the end of Reconstruction, to the New Deal, or to the Civil Rights Revolution? There was no easy answer then. But in response to a question about Trump's foreign policy priorities, a former senior U.S. diplomat responded that Trump's first, second, and third foreign policy priorities would be doing all that he could to increase his family's wealth. And we've been seeing that play out. Look at $800 million for Bitcoin. It came from somewhere. In addition to the priority being given to Gestapo-like police imprisonment and deportations of immigrants, even children, and to the new Cold War with China, and to Trump's imperial ambitions, we've had Qatar's blatant Boeing 747 bribe, and we can read of that $800 million being forked over to Trump. We can assume in significant measure from monarchs, dictators, world plutocrats, as well as cronies and convicts trying to get pardons. So we turn to the nuclear dangers. Tragically, we have a president who is less prepared to deal with nuclear dangers than the president portrayed in the new film, The House of Dynamite. Trump's uninformed and garbled statement about resuming nuclear weapons testing was the focus of the discussion at our last Track 2 session. There are deep concerns that Trump may have sounded the starting gun for existentially dangerous nuclear arms race by both nuclear and currently non-nuclear states. There was something of a consensus that Trump misunderstood reports about recent Russian activities. The claim is that either Russia or China has conducted explosive and not non-critical tests, a claim which has been rejected by the head of the U.S. Strategic Command. Insecure and not wanting to be one up by Putin, Trump issued his threat. When questioned, as Alexandra told us, Trump doubled down on the threat, causing great uncertainty, confusion, and leading the Kremlin to ask for a clarification about U.S. nuclear weapons testing policy. And remember, this brouhaha comes at a time when significant forces in the Republican Party want to resume testing. The Kremlin has yet to receive clarification in terms of their inquiry about the resumption of testing, nor another one in response to Putin's offer to extend at least elements of the New START treaty. Among the arms controllers in that Track 2 session, there is an understanding that if the U.S. or Russia resume testing, it will open the gates for extremely dangerous nuclear weapons proliferation. Among the candidates, again, as Alexandra was saying, for the breakout of South Korea, where most citizens want their nation to develop nuclear weapons out of fear of North Korea's nuclear arsenal and growing uncertainties about the military alliance with the U.S. But we also have Saudi Arabia as a possibility. Iran is there. Its nuclear infrastructure was not obliterated, and it goes on. Russia is reported to be in a position to resume explosive nuclear weapons testing in a relatively short order. But this is not the case for the U.S. The Pentagon could detonate a nuclear weapon as a show of terrorizing force, but it will take an estimated 18 to 36 months to install the highly advanced nuclear testing technologies at the Nevada test site. So it can't be done overnight. Trump's threat needs to be understood in a broader context. The seminally important Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has limited nuclear weapons proliferation and thus the dangers of nuclear war, will be at risk if Trump persists with his testing threat. With the exception of North Korea, nuclear powers have respected the moratorium on testing since the comprehensive test ban was negotiated some 30 years ago. I'm gonna need some water.
Okay. We're getting it.
Okay, we'll soldier on here. Fears abound that if Trump refuses to reverse course about testing before the NPT review conference this April, he could torpedo the treaty. Despite the treaty's double standards and a failure to lead to the elimination of nuclear arsenals as promised, the treaty remains a critical barrier to nuclear weapons proliferation. With the last two review conferences deemed failures for their inability to come to a final declaration, it is feared that a commitment to resume nuclear weapons testing would sink the third RevCom and thus weaken the treaty. In the tradition of 3 strikes and you're out, a third successive NPT review conference failure could doom the NPT. If not immediately, then gradually, as states withdraw from the treaty, begin their testing, and become nuclear weapon states, thereby increasing the dangers, as Alexander was telling us, of nuclear weapons use. We have to hope that there's sufficient wisdom and leverage hidden in the Trump administration to convince him to reverse course. Senator Markey and Representative Titus have introduced legislation to do just that. And it's something that when you're talking to your friends, when you're making those calls, tell them to support the Markey and Titus legislation. We can use those bills to name, shame, and insist on no resumption of nuclear weapons testing. Let me add that even underground nuclear weapons testing, given radioactive venting, is anything but safe. Thank you. It's anything but safe. And just to say, I mean, we've had in this country over time, both from atmospheric but also underground tests, and the creation of the creation of the weapons themselves, the mining, the milling. We have more than 1 million nuclear weapons, radioactive nuclear weapons victims in this country. And it'll break your heart to meet with those people. In fact, some of them played a major role in the negotiation of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I should say that I'm now working with U.S. and international nuclear weapons abolitionists, including Nihon Hidankyo, which won the Nobel Peace Prize a year ago, to organize a President's activities pressure on the various delegations when the governments come to the NPT review conference. We can also remind people that even as we enter into and resist a new U.S.-Russia-China Cold War, agreements between great power rivals are still possible even in the midst of a new Cold War. That was the case with arms control negotiations during the first Cold War. And we should urge the U.S. to join with Russia to extend the elements of the New START Treaty beyond the February expiration. To reduce the nuclear dangers, we also need to recognize that the Ukraine war has been about more than Moscow's resistance to Ukraine joining NATO, an option that was not on the table in February 2022. In a significant measure, the invasion resulted from the arrogance of power in both Moscow and Washington, and from an absence of U.S. strategic empathy. As George Kennan and Fiona Hill warned Clinton and Bush the Lesser, the inability to appreciate that given the histories of Napoleon's, the Kaisers, and Hitler's invasions from the West, the deploying of Western NATO forces on Moscow's border could likely, as they predicted, lead to a potentially military response to the perceived Western threat. Even without Ukraine in NATO, with Poland, the Baltic states long ago, and Norway in the alliance, NATO forces are already along Russia's borders. And as a result of the war, the NATO-Russia front has doubled in size, with Finland and Sweden abandoning the legacies of neutrality and joining the alliance. So it's gotten more interesting and, if you will, more dangerous. The war is also about recreating Europe's strategic architecture. We forget that Moscow's January 2022 proposal, just before the invasion, proposal to the West, called for rolling back the former Soviet republics' memberships in NATO. I think here, especially in terms of the Baltic states. But remember, too, that Europe's immediate post-Cold War geopolitical order was based on common security, commitments not to augment military power at the expense of other nations. And if you go back and look at the Paris Charter, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, you'll see that that was basically the foundation of the post-Cold War order, even as limits were being pushed for the first 20 years after the Cold War. So now we're going to turn to China. Our time is marked by the inherent tensions between rising and declining powers that have often resulted in catastrophic wars. Joe Nye, who was, number 3 at the Pentagon and taught at Harvard for a number of years, said, you know, twice in the 20th century, the Thucydides trap led to catastrophic wars, the First and Second World Wars. The U.S.-China trade war, as we've been experiencing, undermines both nations' economies, and it jeopardizes their people's and world security. And military accidents and miscalculations do happen and can trigger calamitous war. What you see here in one of the pictures is a Chinese fighter pilot coming within about 20 feet of an American warplane. And as we reminded last month, we now live with the possibility of U.S.-Chinese mutually assured economic destruction, as well as mutually assured nuclear destruction. Before the fragile Trump-Xi temporary trade truce negotiated several weeks ago, each side demonstrated its stranglehold over the other's economy. China mines 70% of the world's rare earths and refines 90% of them. These minerals are essential for producing cell phones, computers, fighter jets, nuclear submarines, Predator drones, Tomahawk missiles, and rather more. Without them, the U.S. and the world economy would grind to a halt, and the Pentagon would howl with fury at its inability to build new advanced weapons. But access to the U.S. market also remains essential for Beijing's export economy, and thus China's political stability. The Trump Commerce Department's ill-conceived additional technology export controls aimed at China in early October led to Xi's threat on the total ban on rare earth exports. Trump then compounded the process, our brilliant leader, compounded the crisis that he had created by announcing an additional 100% tariffs on China, cutting them off from the U.S. market. Facing this economic abyss at their Seoul summit, Trump diffused the crisis he had created for both countries, with both of them agreeing to what will likely be a short-term truce. Don't think this is going to be permanent. Friends, this is not a contest that the U.S. is going to win. I hate to say that, but I think it's true. Nobel economist Paul Krugman writes that, quote, China has overtaken America with its larger economy, its annual graduation of 4 times as many engineers, and its generation of twice as much electricity as the U.S. Krugman notes that the U.S. is, quote, in danger of being permanently overtaken by China's technology and economic prowess. And Trump's assaults on our science and education systems further jeopardize our futures. I mean, we need to understand these people are driving the United States backwards, and it's going to powerfully impact our children and grandchildren. I have a grandson who's at another college now, and you know, the whole generation is suffering. In fact, Trump's responses to China have been chaotic and contradictory. He condemns China's, quote, unheard of controls on mineral earths as, quote, cynical, sinister, and hostile. But then he turns around and says, oh, it'll all be fine. He was to meet Xi Jinping in Seoul, then he wasn't, and then he did. The New York Times explains that Trump has, quote, repeatedly seesawed between retaliation and reconciliation, leaving questions about whether he has a larger strategy. Strategy is how much money can I get? Ironically, our would-be monarch emulates ancient and current Chinese practices. In the Tang era tradition, he has used trade negotiations to exact what he boasts as nearly $1 trillion in tribute from Japan and South Korea. Emulating today's Chinese state capitalism, he tilts away from free markets and takes government stakes in companies that produce national security resources. The list begins with Intel, U.S. Steel, and MP Materials, a rare earth mining company. And don't forget that Trump and Xi appear to be almost in a competition to see who can purge more of their senior military leaders to ensure loyalty to the leader. Trump wants to make sure that when he orders troops to come to Princeton, that they'll click their heels, salute, and march off to Princeton. And the same applies, obviously, while Trump favors smash and grab imperialism, China, with the exception of the South China Sea, employs a much more subtle economic strategy to extend its regional and global influence. And there's also the classic military competition for Indo-Pacific dominance. At the end of the 19th century, driven by white Christian manifest destiny, the U.S. launched its overseas empire by conquering stepping stones to the China market, which was seen as the holy grail of capitalism at the time. Philippines, Guam, and Samoa, as well as Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Western Hemisphere, were taken. The U.S. Asia-Pacific empire expanded with Japan's World War II defeat and the transformation of the Pacific Ocean into an American lake. Hundreds of U.S. military bases enforced the imperial domain from Korea and Japan to the Philippines, Guam, Australia, and Diego Garcia, and will soon be joined by a new base on Christmas Island, actually operated by Google, to monitor and control the Indian Ocean. Before the Opium Wars, China's empire was the world's most advanced civilization. It wasn't based on conquest, but was a tributary system, requiring those wishing to engage with the Middle Kingdom to kowtow and pay tribute to the emperor. Sound familiar? In the 1860s, the 1860s Taiping Rebellion and the 20th century Revolutionary Civil War were devastating. But China's last war was fought 20 years ago against Vietnam, and it didn't go well. China's primary strategy, I think historically, has been to surround, isolate, and demonstrate overwhelming power to bring military rivals to heel without having to resort to mass murder. And we should understand war as mass murder. We see this in its reunification campaign for Taiwan, its South China Sea territorial claims, and its massive military buildup. But then, of course, nuclear mad hangs over the U.S.-China military competition. An accident, an incident, or a miscalculation, as U.S. and Chinese naval and air forces confront one another in close proximity around Taiwan and in the South China Sea, could trigger escalation to great power and even nuclear war. With our peace movement's traditional focus on Europe and the Middle East, we urgently need to get on top of this. We urgently need to understand what's happening in the Indo-Pacific region. Biden and Trump have attempted to contain China with a network of military alliances. Oops, I guess I was supposed to go past this one. There's the South China Sea, and you see a Chinese base in the South China Sea. Yeah, we'll get to this. So Biden and Trump have attempted to contain China as a network of Indo-Pacific alliances, military bases, and intermediate-range missiles and missile defenses are deployed around China's periphery. Try to look out at the world from China's perspective. China's greatest vulnerability has long been the possible invasion from the sea. And even if you weren't there at the time, remember Britain's 19th century Opium War invasions and Japan's brutal aggressions in the 1930s. They came from the sea. Thus, to protect its coastal cities, Beijing's military enforces claims. I guess I have to go back. Here we go. You can see here its claims to 80% of the South China Sea, claims that are contested by 5 other nations. Nor can China forget, and here's where I began, China can't forget U.S. nuclear threats in 1955, 1958, and 1996. or Russia's 1969 threat to attack China with nuclear weapons. As Alexander was saying, Beijing has annually been adding an estimated 100 nuclear weapons a year to its arsenal to counter the perceived growing U.S. nuclear threat. Its smaller minimum deterrent nuclear arsenal is theoretically vulnerable to U.S. first strikes. So China is apparently seeking parity with the U.S. and Russia, and our survival thus depends on the 3 U.S., Chinese, and Russian nuclear scorpions in the proverbial bottle. Get that water again? I'm sorry.
No problem.
Got it. Thank you for your patience with that. So the U.S. Indo-Pacific Alliance system is now challenged by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Neo-Alliance, led by the Chinese-Russian alliance and at its core, and augmented by their alliances with North Korea. When the Shanghai Cooperation Organization leaders commemorated the 80th anniversary of Japan's and Germany's World War II defeats, Trump responded with contempt, posting, this is a quote, "Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America." Some way to build peaceful relations. Okay. Then to go to Eldridge Colby. Eldridge Colby, who's the grandson of the former CIA director, is the primary author of Trump's Indo-Pacific military policies. He hedges about whether or not to defend Taiwan, writing that, quote, "To make Taiwan defensible, Taiwan must do more." But Colby is deeply committed to doing everything possible to reinforce U.S. hegemony. To augment the U.S. military pivot to Asia, the Pacific, and now the Indian Ocean, he advocates reducing U.S. support for Ukraine and has begun augmenting the Pentagon's Indo-Pacific forces by reducing U.S. troop levels in Europe. They've just begun that. Like Colby, Trump prioritizes Taiwan's self-defense over U.S. intervention should Beijing seek reunification by force. But he holds to strategic ambiguity and has expressed continuing U.S. commitments to defend Taiwan. This despite the Biden administration having concluded that the only way Taiwan can be defended, ultimately, is by threat of first strike attack against China. As I said, Trump has no strategic vision, except we know domination. But we shouldn't discount possible openings that could come with his transactional approach to just about everything. He compensates for lack of strategic vision with tariffs and bluster. For Taiwan, he hedges, demanding the island's strategically vital chip industry build production facilities in the U.S. And if you want to talk about nonsense, where are these big installations being built that consume so much water? They're being built in Arizona, where there's no water. And Trump also is critical of Taiwan, calling it a freeloader on the U.S. defense system. Divisions within the administration reflect Trump's contradictions. Some America First officials advocate returning to regional blocs reminiscent of the 19th century concert of Europe. These officials are less committed to alliances, and we saw their influence in the massive tariffs imposed on India, despite successive presidents courting New Delhi as a possible counter to China's power. This clique also forced a review of the AUKUS alliance, the Australia, U.S., and Britain, but they failed to undermine it, nor the commitment to provide Australia with new nuclear submarines. And if we're going to give nuclear submarines to Australia, well, South Korea wants them too. And if South Korea is going to get them, Japan wants them. Traditionally, traditional military imperialists retain greater influence in the administration. In Asia last month, Trump reaffirmed the Golden Alliance with Japan and the alliance with South Korea. And soon after coming to power, Hegseth and Rubio signaled their commitments by traveling to South Korea and Japan and by dispatching a U.S. warship to the Taiwan Strait. Send a signal here. Beijing's priorities differ significantly from those of Washington. Chinese priorities are domestic and international stability. Beijing wants to take, but not destroy, what it understands as its rogue province of Taiwan, in order to limit casualties and infrastructure damage, and it wants to seize, not devastate, Taipei's advanced chip-making facilities. Thus, it prefers to win Taiwanese hearts and minds, primarily via Taiwan's economic dependence on the world's largest economy. Invading Taiwan would mean loss of international markets, diplomatic isolation, and possible long-term resistance. It also bears noting that while most Taiwanese no longer identify as Chinese and favor future independence, almost none of them are willing to fight for it. So we need to look at this with clear eyes and not accept the kind of headlines and the propaganda that comes at us. There is an alternative to the new U.S.-China Cold War. We still have the paradigm that ended the first Cold War, common security diplomacy. Then, when preparations for thermonuclear war spiraled almost beyond control, Swedish Prime Minister Palme convened senior Soviet, European, and U.S. officials to devise an off-ramp from the threatened nuclear Armageddon. It came with the concept of common security, recognition that no nation can be secure if its rivals feel threatened. Through difficult negotiations, Washington and Moscow, during the Cold War, agreed not to deploy the terrorizing, accurate, and decapitating intermediate nuclear armed missiles that were driving the spiraling nuclear arms race. Many of you here will remember that by addressing their respective fears, the two powers opted not to deploy the SS-20 cruise and Pershing II missiles. That agreement with the INF Treaty ended the Cold War in 1987, 2 years before the fall of Berlin Wall. And it's just to say our freeze movement played a powerful role in ending it. We don't celebrate that enough. Then, as I said before, from the Paris Treaty through the NATO-Russia Founding Act, common security secured the first 2 decades of the post-Cold War alliance. Common security can also be applied to China. I have got copies of this with me here, actually. The 2024 Common Security in the Indo-Pacific Region report, written by scholars and movement leaders from across the region, illustrates that the paradigm can also be applied there. Tensions within the near the Taiwan Strait can be reduced with shared recognition that Taiwan's future cannot be determined by military means, that provocative military actions by all parties should cease, and there are a lot of them, and that the One China doctrine, negotiated by Presidents Nixon and Carter, must be respected. The South China Sea can also be demilitarized. As former U.S. Ambassador Chaz Freeman remarked, resolution of the sea's territorial claims do not require Washington's intervention. We should, he say, let the people of the region sort it out. Provocative military operations should cease, as should the construction of all new U.S. and Chinese military bases there. The region's nations can engage in bilateral and multilateral negotiations for a South China Sea Code of Conduct. And no first-use nuclear doctrines in a regional nuclear weapons-free zone need to be negotiated. And I think we need to take the Chinese rhetoric seriously and push back on it, and push on it here as well. So then I want to turn to the counter-revolution here, and this will be maybe bringing coals to Newcastle, but then we can burn them. So there's the brutal, come on, Joe, the brutal counter-revolution being waged by Trump and MAGA here in the United States. My understandings of authoritarianism are rooted in lessons from the Nazi Holocaust, in the refugee philosopher Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, Karl Jaspers on the question of German guilt, read James Baldwin, Albert Camus, Arthur Koestler, Milo Vangelis, and others. Essential to Arendt's analysis of Hitler's and Stalin's dictatorships were her understandings of the central role played by fear, terror, and ideology, all designed to destroy individuality. This resulted in personal atomization, isolation, and totalitarian control of society. Essential to these processes was the assault on truth. This describes where we live now. We are also dealing with very aggressive fascist forces here, but the U.S. is not yet a fascist nation. Billionaire, racist, kleptocratic autocrats, among them Trump, whose father was in the Ku Klux Klan, as well as Musk and Thiel, whose worldviews were forged by South African and Rhodesian apartheid, and their peers are all on the offensive. Fortunately, as we saw in the No Kings demonstrations in October, there is broad popular, legal, academic, and media resistance to Trump MAGA fascism. The Trump MAGA rise to power and its seizure of power are consequences of at least four powerful forces. First, unresolved racism rooted in the country's original sin of slavery. And look, there's a deep relationship between U.S. foreign military intervention, its nuclear threats, and racism. Second is the loss of Roosevelt-Johnson New Deal values, combined with neoliberal greed and the technological and structural changes that allowed the creation of a billionaire class and the catastrophic economic inequality. Third, corruptions in the Democratic Party that date to President Clinton, who's my classmate, and before. And fourth, the debilitating and costly failed U.S. post-Cold War wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere, which, along with the rise of China and the global South, have accelerated comparative U.S. and Western decline. Think about what it's like when South Africa brings the claim to the World Court. Right? Things have changed. For a historical analogy, think about German dislocations after the World War I defeat. The Versailles Treaty, which inflicted staggering inflation and poverty in Germany, and the power of historic anti-Semitic and Nazi ideologies. We speak of the Trump MAGA regime as, quote, flooding the zone. Illegal and unconstitutional assaults are coming at us faster than we can track them. Over the past 40 years, the Supreme Court, which promised us hope in the 1950s and 60s, has been stacked with extreme right-wing functionaries, as Republicans in Congress have also given up on holding the executive branch accountable, except maybe there's a bit of a sexual scandal going on. And these people fear that they'll lose their status and privilege, these members of Congress, maybe members of the Supreme Court, that they'll lose their status and privileges unless they click their heels and salute in response to each destructive Trump demand. In addition to protecting our innocent immigrant neighbors, many of us are also working to understand the implications of a little-noticed national security directive that identifies, and this is a quote, anti-Christian, anti-American views as indicators of radical left violence. It's the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, which is titled Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence, and it directs the Justice Department, the FBI, and other national security agencies to, quote, take action against anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, extremism on migration, race and gender, hostility to traditional American family values and traditional values on religion, and to American views on morality. These people are talking about morality? Reading and listening to our daily news has indeed become painful. On a daily basis, we read or hear about the government's illegal and unconscionable actions. Innocent immigrants and sometimes even citizens are kidnapped from our streets, from their homes, schools, places of worship, and workplaces by masked Gestapo-like police in the Trump MAGA's white nationalist ethnic cleansing campaign. The Supreme Court has authorized racial profiling. I mean, imagine that. My family's not all white. My grandson, my daughter are Latino. My grandson, we send him to school carrying his passport. And the former FBI director, and now we have the former New York Attorney General, have been indicted for attempting to hold Trump accountable for just a few of his crimes. Maybe this is more for the students here than otherwise, but Orwell, Vonnegut, Zinn, and others wrote that if we don't know our history, we cannot be free. Not unlike German universities in the 30s and 40s, Trump is requiring institutions of higher learning to align with MAGA ideology. Priority funding is to go to universities like the University of Texas, which revise their curricula, including criticism of conservative ideas, and who hire faculty aligned with MAGA. References to diversity, equity, and inclusion are being banned from universities, workplaces, and even the military. Thus, the history of slavery and the struggles for justice are being literally whitewashed, with curricula rewritten, and in some cases, books vanishing from libraries. Meanwhile, in the tradition of Putin, Xi, and Orban, our press faces constant threats and restrictions. Look at who now populates the White House and Pentagon press offices. Beyond history, the president, who once advised people to inject cleaning fluids to overcome COVID, has unleashed the war on science. He's blocked billions of dollars needed for research and unleashed his anti-vaxxer Secretary of Health and Human Services against our health systems and our very lives. So, I call this section Stupids in Charge. History, we know, does not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. Recently, I was reading about Charles de Gaulle, and I learned that during his first term as French head of state, he humiliated a cabinet member, saying, quote, "I chose the most stupid man because I thought he would be the most loyal." Bingo. The Nobel Prize economist Paul Krugman put it well, saying that we're being ruled by a, quote, autocracy of dunces. Several weeks ago, Trump and Secretary of Defense Hegseth, the former TV personality who installed a makeup room in the Pentagon and who supports a Christian Crusader tattoo, ordered 800 generals and admirals to assemble at Quantico Marine Base. The gathering's purpose was a deeply held secret, arousing fears that, like in other banana republics, our military would be required to pledge loyalty to the revered leader and not to the Constitution. So it was with obvious displeasure that these generals and admirals endured embarrassing, racist, and rambling bloviation from the commander-in-chief. Generals and admirals had to sit through a soliloquy about how presidents should walk to avoid falling, condemning fat, and disregard for racial and gender equality. More disturbing, the president urged the military to use his unconstitutional troop deployments to U.S. cities as training grounds to fight the enemy within, meaning urban communities of color. This was followed with brutal and dehumanizing effect in Chicago, and by a warning from Governor Pritzker that deployments are being made to prepare for the seizure of ballot boxes during the 2026 elections. We have to take all this stuff seriously. Trump's incoherence was so unhinged that it raised questions about invoking the 25th Amendment. I'm supposed to have the 25th Amendment here. 25th Amendment that provides for the removal of an incapacitated president. But of course, his cabinet is stocked with insecure and incompetent loyalists. The day after the military assembled, the Pentagon went on to instill fear among 5,000 of its most senior officers and employees. They are now required to sign non-disclosure agreements and will be subject to random polygraph tests to confirm their loyalty to Trump and to prevent embarrassing leaks. Again, I think in terms of the possibility of using the military to enforce dictatorship. It wouldn't be the first country. There are also dangers of the Trump wars and greater institutionalization of militarism. Our headlines are full of nonsense about what will prove to be the failures of Trump's so-called Middle East grand bargain and the very real dangers of military and economic smash-and-grab campaigns to seize Venezuela, Panama, Greenland, and Gaza's beaches. Almost done. With history rhyming and the post-Cold War now history, we live in a time reminiscent of the one that led to World War I. We have a Thucydides trap of rising and declining powers, a dynamic that has often led to catastrophic wars. We are in arms races with new technologies, complex, uncertain alliance structures, intense economic competition and integration, growing nationalism, territorial disputes, and wild card actors from Trump to Netanyahu. Compounding these dynamics is the Ukraine war, which is a war between Putin and the West over Europe's future. And it still carries the possibility of danger to escalation to nuclear war. No longer contained to the Ukrainian borderlands, drones that threaten Europe's airports and infrastructure are compounding fears that are driving increasing military preparations, spending, and exercises across Western Europe. There is also a broad frame of reference which came from Ulysses Torres. Many years ago, during the Central America Wars, we had him come speak to a number of us at the American Friends Service Committee. And one of my colleagues asked him, she said, "When do you know if you have a military government?" And his response was, "Look at your national budget. More than 50% of our budget, I'm losing the word here for lack of sleep. But anyhow, so you get the idea. More than half of our national government, here we go, more than half of our national government's discretionary spending is devoted to the military and military-related institutions like the CIA, the National Security Agency, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. That budget now exceeding $1 trillion and totaling 40% of world military spending. U.S. military spending is greater than Russia's and China's combined. Trump is now also committed to the military-industrial complex's Golden Dome missile defense boondoggle. It won't work. The head of the Arms Control Association said a few weeks ago, he talks to physicists. All the physicists he talked to say it won't work. And guess what? China has physicists. But it will break the bank. If it goes forward, it will lead to bankruptcy in the United States. And this at a time when we can't afford health, food for the poor, or housing. But we do need to acknowledge that Europe lies between a rock and a hard place. On one side, NATO is dominated by the increasingly undemocratic and autocratic U.S., and on the other, there is the undemocratic and autocratic Russia, whose response to NATO expansion was the invasion of Ukraine and its call to roll back NATO membership. Okay, so let me pick you up off the floor, and say hope is something that we find within ourselves, and it's something that we create. And these are things that we can do. At the most basic level, with fascism and neoliberalism threatening our most basic human rights, the imperative is to insist on respect for our dignity, for constitutional democracy, and for the rule of legitimate law. And I add the word legitimate for a purpose. Friends, this may not be the ninth inning, bottom of the ninth inning, but it's certainly late in the game. We can take some hope from last week's election results and from Trump's terrible polling numbers and from the Epstein-Trump scandal. But we must walk and chew gum at the same time. We urgently need to protect constitutional democracy and to prevent catastrophic great power war and the smash and grab lesser wars. Noam Chomsky put it well a few years ago. He said, there is almost nothing that we don't know how to deal with. At the height of the pandemic, he reminded us, there were practical solutions to containing COVID. Like the people gathered this week at the COP30, he reminded us that we can heal the environment with practical solutions. Nuclear weapons, he said? Obviously, get rid of them. The question, he stressed, is whether we have the will. And there is, he reminded us, no alternative to doing all we can. And I want to just, there's a question to Alexandra before about what can we do. At a most, I developed a theory, it's not widely known, it's called the get your yayas out there theory. It means if you take what you were thinking and engage other people, if you put up some signs around the campus, if you take action, others will take action too. But it means getting off your duff and acting and organizing. And friends, we are not alone, and we can take strength from our past. For me, that means drawing on the stories and the courage of ordinary Europeans I was privileged to know and work with decades ago who had resisted Nazi occupations nonviolently. They had some funny stories, too. I can tell if you have questions. For all of us, there is a civil rights history and the knowledge that people of color in this country have never had it easy, but they have persisted. It's also worth reading about the sit-down strikes of the 1930s, the creation of unions, and their roles in the New Deal, the Great Society, and civil rights victories. And we take hope from the nuclear weapons freeze movement in the 1980s, when a very small band of organizers, say two very small band of organizers, played leading roles, educators and organizers, in reducing the nuclear danger and ending the Cold War. Our greatest responsibility is to preserve constitutional democracy, because without that, we're powerless. If the midterm president elections are stolen, we need to remember the meaning of people's power and sovereignty to the people. In other countries, as in other countries, we can defend democracy with a nationwide general strike. We need to think about it and talk about it, learn what a general strike is, talk with people in unions, talk with your churches, and think about what we do in a situation when power is fundamentally seized away from us. We can use our state and local governments to protect and provide for the resources that are being denied by the heartless Trump MAGA government. And remember, too, that Republicans are no less vulnerable to the nuclear cataclysm than are Democrats or socialists. We need to press them all to support the extension of the essential elements of the New START treaty, I'm just about there, before it expires, and to prevent any resumption of nuclear weapons testing. I'll just skip to here to say, some of you might want to read a book by Miles Horton called We Make Our Road by Walking. That's what we do. And I want to close by quoting Martin Luther King. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valleys of authoritarianism, deceit, and militarism to the sunlit path of justice and peace. Now is the time to lift our nations from the quicksands of brutality and injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a real reality for all. So I went on a bit long, but I hope it's good. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gerson, for that very comprehensive overview of all of the challenges that we face. So our next speaker said he's only going to speak half an hour, so we can take about 10 minutes, I think, for some questions for Dr. Gerson, and still be finishing by our goal of 4:30. So let's see some hands. Richard, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's take those 4, 5. Well, yeah, 5. Let's take those questions. So number 1.
Dr. Gerson, this is more of a general question about the threat of a nuclear winter. Because I am really concerned that just a simple tactical use of nuclear weapons by, let's say, India and Pakistan is going to cause massive deaths throughout the world with the nuclear winter, killing people nowhere near the combat zone, but going around the world. Could you comment on that, please?
Sure. The expert is over here wearing a red shirt. And what we know from a study that he did and was put out by Physicians for Social Responsibility, among others, is that a limited India-Pakistan nuclear war, the explosions would kill millions and millions initially, but then the smoke from the fires will blanket the northern hemisphere, leading to the reduction of temperature, to crop failures, and the death of many is maybe 2 billion people. That's not nuclear winter. It still leaves several billion people alive. But if you look at the recent House of Dynamite film, for example, what you see is there's one nuclear weapon coming in at Chicago, and the question is whether our unprepared president sends the order, because he's afraid of what's going to happen, to destroy preemptively the Russian and Chinese arsenals. And at that point, of course, you can kiss your tuchus goodbye.
Okay, let's quickly go to number 2. Who was number 2?
Man over here.
Yeah.
Speak loud if you can.
Stand up and speak loudly.
I know that a lot of the volatility surrounding policy around nuclear weapons and foreign policy today surrounds characters like President Trump and his cronies, like fellow Princetonian Pete Hegseth. I also know that among people like our age, there's a lack of understanding of, say, nuclear weapons, disarmament, and that kind of aspect right now. As like was mentioned in the opening remarks, we never lived through the Cold War or the height of proliferation. So how do you suggest that people like students, people our age, begin these conversations to A, educate others about these things, and B, kind of enact policy change in the future?
So, it's interesting. I've been trying to work on the generational divide and change. So we've invited some young people to be on our board. In fact, we'll have on Tuesday night a webinar with 2 of them, one who went to Hiroshima last year and the other who organized the number 2 organizer for the big Boston 80th anniversary commemoration. They'll be talking with German and Serbian young activists and scholars. I don't have any easy answers. I'm an old, I'll say it. I'm an old fart. And the reality is that each generation has to find in some ways its own way. But at one level, simply studying is the first step. Learning these issues, having discussion groups, inviting speakers, showing films. And as I said, things can start from a very small group. And all of you, each one of you here know kids in other colleges, right? If each of you were to invite 10 friends and have conversations about what you could do education, what you can do that. We're in the early process of organizing civil society activities during the NPT review conference that comes up in April. We're trying to think through what will be most valued by young people. Again, we've got several young people working in the planning. That's not enough. And so, you know, I'm glad to have your contact information. I'm glad to see what we can do together. That's how you make change. You just put your yayas out there and do the best you can do.
Number 3? Yes, Stephanie.
Now, I am terrified by the idea that we have a lunatic in the White House who can press a button with no advisors around him to stop him. And I'm wondering, how do you envision another scenario where we would be more protected from one person making that quintessential decision?
Well, the first step is to kick the bastard out. I mean, you know, I think we all have, you know, reasonable fear. And so we have that. Beyond that, it's going to take congressional action to change the law. And that means organizing. That means going to meet members of Congress to talk about this. Elaine Scarry, who teaches at Harvard, wrote a book called Thermonuclear Monarchy. And she goes into that in considerable detail. And sorry to say, it's not only the United States where that applies. So, you know, our species has, you know, the Enlightenment did a number of really good things. But we also have been taking on, assuming the powers of, some would call it God, others would just call life. And I think we have to just recognize that that's the case and then do everything we can do to change it. I made reference earlier to people I knew in Europe. I was there in the early 70s, mid-70s. And these were ordinary people, school masters, housewives, ordinary people who took the risk of feeding people in the underground, of hiding people in their homes, all at the risk of death, because they knew what was important. And when we come down to it in the end, I think, we have to just hold on to what we think is most important and then just work our butts off. And beyond that, there's no easy answers. You know, Alexandra was talking about members of Congress. I mean, so few of them understand what reality is. And, you know, it's up to us to do what we can to rub their noses in it.
Just one quick thing in between here is that during the first Trump term, Representative Ted Lieu led an effort and a good piece of legislation that restricting first use of nuclear weapons. And it was only if the U.S. was under attack could the president decide unilaterally. Everything else Congress would have to approve. And that made a lot of sense to me. So I think we could try to revive that effort.
I'd walk it back even further.
Yeah. Number 4, who was 4th?
You?
Thank you.
As a member of selecting committee, or as a member of selecting committee of Nobel Peace Prize individual, my question is, how much politics plays a role to select a Peace Prize laureate?
So clearly it plays a significant role. I think it varies from year to year. You know, a number of us had worked to get Nihan Hidankyo the Nobel Peace Prize for years. I think within the Nobel Committee, there was a recognition that if they didn't give the Hibakusha the Nobel Prize before they died, that it would reflect poorly on the Nobel Committee. And on the 80th anniversary, it provided a way to raise it. I have to say it's worth taking a look on video. You can find it online. Just go to the Nobel Prize Committee. You'll find the video of the ceremony. And I have to say, I was extraordinarily struck. I think we all were. I mean, Tanaka Terumi, who was kind of the leader of the Hidakyo delegation, many of us have heard him speak before. It was a very good speech. It brought a number of the A-bomb survivors to tears as they relived their experience again. But I have to say, I was most impressed with the address by the young head of the Peace Prize Committee, who, some of you will remember, there was a right-wing fascist terrorist who attacked a Norwegian retreat of rising socialist politicians, killed about 80 of them. Well, the guy who headed the Peace Prize Committee was, I don't know if he was there at the time, but he was responsible for rebuilding the island. And as part of that, he had to talk to the families of everyone who was killed. And when he gave his speech, I mean, his speech is absolutely worth listening to. He rooted it in an understanding of trauma. He rooted it in understanding the trauma that the Hibakusha have experienced and their rare courage in transforming their physical and psychic pain into this powerful force for nuclear disarmament. This year, I wrote to friends at Hidakyo and I said, I think the Nobel Prize Committee ennobled the prize last year when they gave it to you. I think the prize this year, I don't know, you've got Norwegian politicians involved. There are right-wing at the dinner, at the Nobel Peace Prize dinner, which is this amazing kind of thing. I mean, I'm just, which one of these is not like the others? The husband of one of the left-leaning members of parliament sitting next to my wife, and he points over to this woman in a blue dress. He said, well, at least she's not wearing her Iron Cross today. She was the leading fascist in the Norwegian parliament was there. I mean, everybody was there.
Okay, let's quickly go to question 5, and then we'll.
Okay.
Were you 5? Yes, he was 5. Okay, and then we'll move on.
Okay. Yep.
So if return to testing would crater the NPT review conference, what's a countervailing force that civil society could exert to try and protect a good outcome?
I think what we have to do is just raise holy hell right now to prevent resumption of testing. That's the best thing we can do. Expectations for the review conference are very low, but we use that to press as we can. There'll be people coming from a number of different countries. There'll be about 100 coming from Japan, including Hibakusha, and you will use that for international movement developing. If Reverend Moore or Zia here would like to host a delegation of Hibakusha and Japanese leaders, we can see if we can work that out. So that's sort of what we can look at. But we have to look to, on the one hand, serious and thoughtful people who are in government, because there are many of them. But they work within a lot of restrictions. And as we learn from the Freeze movement, as we learn from the Civil Rights movement, as we learn from the women's movement, it's when you build power, when you make impossible demands, when you press, that's when you can get governments to move. But without popular motion, very little will happen. So with that, I'm sorry I went on so long. Thank you.
And now we come to our final speaker, and I'm happy to be introducing him. He gave an outstanding sermon at this morning's multi-faith service, the Reverend Wes Granberg Michelson. And his bio is in the program, so I'm not going to go over that again with you. But let me just say that sermon was just totally on the mark, and it was only 20 minutes long. Wow. What a combination. So anyway, he's going to speak for about a half hour, and then we'll take some Q&A from his speech as well. Let's welcome Reverend Granberg Michelson.
Thank you very much. It's been a long day. We've heard so many good things. I will try to make a comments around 3 points and then have some time for discussion. First of all, I want to thank Bob. I've only gotten to meet Bob more during my visit here. We've had great discussions together. I've learned so much about him. I think Bob was involved in every peace social activist movement since the Revolutionary War. And I'm amazed at what he's done and at the coalition and to learn of its work. Really.
Thank you so much.
And I'm delighted to be with Alexandra and with Joseph. You see from my biography, I started my career 10 years on Capitol Hill and in D.C. I can tell you this, that a person like Alexandra Bell, when you're an aide to a senator or a member of House and you're trying to get stuff done for your boss and something around some big issue like nuclear disarmament comes up, and what you do is that you figure out, who do I call? And if you're on the kind of disarmament side of these issues, Alexandra Bell is the person whom you call. And she has played that role forever, apart from her service in administrations with Obama and Biden, also back to the Council for Livable World, which made a huge impact way back to early arms control discussions when I was on the staff and we were working with those issues in the United States Senate. And also, of course, now with the Physicians of Atomic, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which is a kind of a Bible for people who are in the disarmament movement. And Joseph, whom I've also only met for the first time here, he was present at creation for so much of what's happened, and particularly the nuclear freeze movement that I'm going to say a few words about. He, as well as Bob, were very instrumental in that story. But I want to start, a few of you may be at the worship service and heard my sermon. In some ways, this is kind of the secular follow-up, you know. What do we do if we're committed to the values that we say we are? And I think the first question we ask is, what's really possible? Is this approach that I think you've heard about from Joseph of nonviolent solidarity, a call to love one's enemies, this radical call to peacemaking, is any of it possible and realistic? Well, I think we should look at the historical evidence because it's different than what many people think. A lot is overlooked, and Joseph has already pointed up some examples. And I also want to draw your attention to some sources maybe you haven't heard about. Maybe I could contribute something. One of them is a woman, Elizabeth Newman, who served in the Department of Homeland Security under President Trump. She was deputy director, and then she decided that this was against all her values, against her own personal faith. She left, now is in a research foundation in Colorado, and wrote a book, The Kingdom of Rage, which is a terrific book. I'll simply say this. After serving as an expert in counterterrorism, she really has become convinced about how we navigate a path back to peace. She's done, as I say, that one book, and she's also done research with others in examining a central question, which is, how does a determined terrorist who's committed to violence, how can such a person be changed? What happens when such a person goes through a process of change? And the conclusion is that that process of change begins when one experiences extreme empathy that's extended from a person who is totally unexpected. Amen. And it's exactly what Alex was saying about empathy. The power to extend empathy from an unexpected source. And if you go to my faith tradition, it's another way of talking about loving your enemies. And it's simply saying there's power. There's a power in the kind of values of empathy and understanding which often get discounted when you're in the policy-making world. But they have a real effect. When you look at history, I mentioned in my sermon, but the most famous examples are, of course, Gandhi and the Salt March and Martin Luther King, Thich Nhat Hanh, etc. But there's a long list. I mean, you look at the Women's Peace Movement Initiative in Liberia that ended a civil war through protest and prayer and mass action. Even more than that, the U.S. Institute of Peace, I want to say a word first about its creation. So I was really kind of a young kid, found myself in D.C., became the chief aide to Mark Hatfield, and he was new. And we had this discussion. And he said, Wes, what we need to do is establish a peace academy because we've got these military academies. And then it was real interesting. And he said, and then we've got the War Department. Of course, they call it the Defense Department, but it's really a War Department. So he kind of agreed with Hicks of that. He says, what we need to establish is some place that really focuses energy around peacemaking. And so we put this, he filed this bill and started work. He worked for 15 years with others, Spark Mexanata, and he got Jennings involved, got a couple, and finally it came to Reagan, and through a lot of influence got Reagan to sign and establish the U.S. Institute of Peace in 1984. And that institute, I mean, it wasn't perfect. It, did a lot of different stuff, but it really opened up the way for looking at alternatives to peacemaking within the policymaking community that was more or less dominated by strategies around war and defense. And one of the things they did was that they did a major study of civic actions, of nonviolent civic actions. And I mentioned this morning, one of those studies was done by Maria Stephan, who is a person you should take note of, along with Erica Chenoweth. But Maria Stephan, who's one of the experts in the history of nonviolent civic movements. They studied 323 movements for change, both violent and nonviolent, from 1900 to 2006, over 100 years. They studied all of them, and the conclusion they came to is that those that were nonviolent achieved their goals 53% of the time. Those that were violent achieved their goals 26% of the time. And you could go to the U.S. Institute of Peace, even though Trump dismantled all the budget, it still exists, it's still got a website, a new administration could get it up and running again. You could find the detailed study of this and much more. And that's only to say that these things are more possible than we think. And in this environment today, everyone like us in this room is saying, what can we do? Because we see the way in which democratic options and powers are being eroded and taken away. What we don't realize is that most civic nonviolent actions have been taken against authoritarian governments. And there's a whole history of this. And Joseph touched on those at the end of his presentation. Right now, there are many training sessions in nonviolent civic resistance that are beginning to go on. And there's also a whole reservoir of study around peacemaking efforts in several universities and other places. So there's really stories and resources about ways to act from the grassroots that have historical relevance, that have been done in history, that are possible today. So that when you say, what can we do, you have to expand your imagination and say, well, maybe we could do things that others have done in other situations when they've been faced with a reality that feels like there's not much they can do in an official policy way. Well, you can do stuff at a grassroots level, and it can and has had effects. It's had effects of overturning and changing governments. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is to talk a bit more about the anti-nuclear movement. There's very little I could add to what Alexandra and Joseph have said. I mean, look, I spend my time today worrying about ecumenical efforts around the world and traveling and writing about how you put together the quest for justice with theology and spirituality, and how you preach on a Sunday about a text from my tradition and make it relevant to the Bible and to the news, hold the Bible in one hand, the newspaper in another hand, and try to make sense. I mean, that's kind of where my energy is going today. But I've had a history of being in the world in which Alexandra and Joseph have spent their lives in. And particularly that was true around the nuclear freeze campaign. And I want to just underscore how important it is to learn from those histories. And I'll recite again, I know Bob was involved in that as well as Joseph and others. I'll give you a really brief history. It was 1981 when a guy named Randall Fosberg wrote a famous article. A woman, Randall Fosberg, wrote an article on how to stop the nuclear arms race. And it triggered something. It triggered new movement, because at that time, all the discussion about arms control was simply putting limits on how much we could increase. That's where the policy making was. And it just introduced a simple but fresh challenge. And it was taken up in 1982. It happened that it was Mark Hatfield, along with Ted Kennedy, introduced a resolution around nuclear freeze. This wasn't some far-out fringe thing. They introduced the resolution, and immediately it had 26 co-sponsors in the United States Senate. It had 160 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. It began to move. By 1983, public polling was showing that 72% of Americans were in favor. Reagan was president. He was opposed. He got reelected in '84. The pressure around it continued. And some of this history, which Alexandra and Joseph would know well, between '84 and '86, when the Berlin Wall fell, and then Gorbachev came to power, Reagan and Gorbachev had a private exchange of letters in which Reagan was saying, we really should explore how we can reduce or eliminate nuclear weapons. Gorbachev eventually came back with a proposal for eliminating all nuclear weapons in 15 years and a whole strategy for doing so. There was a real dialogue in which the leaders of the two most powerful nuclear countries at that time were really talking about our goal of abolishing nuclear weapons. They came to the Reykjavik summit in 1986, and what blocked it was Reagan's refusal to give up Star Wars, the SDI defense. And frankly, I'm told, I don't know, maybe you know Alexandra, but I'm told that it was really Richard Pearl and 2 or 3 other people who were in Reagan's ear at Reykjavik who said, Mr. President, you can't do this. But we came that close. And then what followed were a series of arms control agreements that did make real progress in reducing. But now that it's like that's all forgotten, and we're at a point that both Joseph and Alexandra have spelled out that is really becoming critical. Around where I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, I have people in the little congregation that my wife and I are serving who work at the Los Alamos lab. I talked about that this morning, where a massive nuclear weapons modernization program is going with hardly any discussion, any understanding of what the implications are. I mean, we are at a point where public movement around these issues is essential, because as Bob and Joseph have said, these changes that come at the policy level always come in response to what happens from public pressure. Amen. It really does. And I could tell you from my period of time in policymaking in D.C., Alexandra and Joseph will say the same thing. It really does make a difference, and that's what has propelled the agreements that we have had towards any form of nuclear disarmament. And we've got to have faith, as the response came in a couple of your questions, that if we start where we can now, we can see how that can build. We can see, we can't control that, but at certain times things begin to come together and movements start. That's what happened in the Freeze campaign. You had referenda in several states, in city councils. You had 1 million people in Central Park. You had all kinds of organizations. I mean, that kind of mobilization can happen. And that's where we have to direct, I think, our effort and our hope. I'll give you a couple of examples. Where I live in New Mexico, we have a Catholic archbishop who is John Wester. He was here he was here 2 years ago and gave the sermon at the service where I was this morning. I've gotten to know him in New Mexico. Here's what happened. In 2017, he traveled to Hiroshima. And for the first time, he experienced all of that, and then to Nagasaki. And he came back and he said, well, here, I'm the Catholic Archbishop of the Archdiocese where the nuclear bomb was created. And what do I do? And when I look at Catholic social teaching, and now I hear my Pope Francis, saying it's immoral to possess a nuclear weapon, what do I do? And he began an anti-nuclear program as Archbishop. Amen. He got the Diocese of Santa Fe and then of Seattle to link with the Diocese of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in a joint effort to plea for the abolition of nuclear weapons. He wrote a major pastoral letter in which John Deere, whom some of you know, took a major part in helping him draft, which has had a huge impact. He's been in dialogue with the Vatican, and at the Vatican, there have been private discussions going on for about 2-3 years around how to reconsider and reformulate what is called the traditional just war theory. And these kinds of changes at that level can make a huge difference. Wester, one of the things he says, which I really like, is this: it's often said that pursuing nuclear disarmament is naive. But isn't it truly naive to think that we can rely on luck to avoid nuclear catastrophe? I mean, that's from an archbishop. And so I think we have to realize it's those who are convicted by conscience and by, in many cases, their faith tradition, who decide to take decisive action, not knowing what the results are going to be, knowing that many people are going to call them foolish and unrealistic, but whose actions can have an effect in changing the way people think, changing the questions that people ask, giving people a new vision and a new way of thinking about an issue, in this case, such as the abolition of nuclear weapons. The third point I'd like to make is this, and that's peacemaking has roots also in our own internal transformation. We can't separate the outward action we do for peacemaking, in my view, from how we deal internally in ourselves with our attitudes, with however we claim our own spiritual or ethical life. And when you look at the most prominent peace movement advocates, you find that there are people who always understood this. You really think about it. When you think about a Dr. Martin Luther King, when you think about Desmond Tutu, there's a great story about Desmond Tutu. I like to tell it because he liked to tell it. He was one of the key people with others, of course, in the anti-apartheid movement. He's an Anglican bishop. He finds out, traveling in the United States, that there are a group of nuns in California who are praying for him and for the apartheid movement. And they're getting up at 3 in the morning, and their prayers are always in support of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And so in his cathedral, there comes a major demonstration, a major service, and the cathedral has been surrounded by the South African police, and it's a point of high tension. And he walks out and talks to the police, and he says, "My friends, do you know that there are a group of nuns in California who are getting up at 3 in the morning every day to pray for an end to apartheid? You don't have a chance." We have to learn how we put this together from whatever our faith traditions might be. And to understand that changing reality is so important, because we've got to get off from the binary, transactional, peace through strength mentality. We've got to reverse that mentality, and that starts with our own work. And that's how an alternative vision for the future gets embodied. And I want to give you, again, a practical example of someone who lived this out, and it's often forgotten. And that was Dag Hammarskjöld, one of the most amazing general secretaries of the United Nations. Swedish. He was raised in the Church of Sweden. His father was a top government diplomat. He went into the UN and became general secretary from 1953 until 1961, when he was killed in a plane crash in the Congo in circumstances that have never been fully clarified and known. After he died, he had a book of journal entries he had kept his whole time, and he had given it to a friend. The friend looked at it and said, "Maybe this should be published." Gave it to a major publisher. It was published. W.H. Auden, who's a name that some of you in the Christian community would know, wrote the foreword. It was called Markings. It became a bestseller. And it turned out that Dag Hammarskjöld, his whole life, was deeply influenced by an inner spiritual sense calling him to what he was doing. The person he loved to read was Meister Eckhart, one of the famous mystics. And he brought to that outer diplomatic service this inner spiritual grounding, which really gave him the kind of impact that he had in those early days of the UN. I think it's the sort of thing that we need now. And so those 3 things are what I would humbly leave you with. The first, expand your imagination about what is possible, even in our situation, particularly through local nonviolent actions that have historically shown what can happen. And second, think and learn from what has happened previously in the anti-nuclear movement through initiatives like the nuclear freeze, and how that same kind of possibility is essential now if the kind of policy changes we would dream about and that Alexandra has talked about have a chance of success. And third, ask yourself, how can each of us internalize the very things we campaign for and talk about in terms of understanding the changes in the outer world that we seek are also going to have to be accompanied by the deep resources of change within ourselves. Because I think we are in for a hard time for several years. And I think people are going to burn out and get tired and go home unless they realize they're rooted in something far deeper than just what is going to happen in the next week. And that they're responding far more to basic callings rather than how am I going to respond to the latest outrage in the news. And who have a deeply grounded sense of where they're being called and a future that needs to happen. Those kinds of leaders are going to require a kind of inner grounding in any of us for the long term are going to have to prepare ourselves with the resources that will allow us to do that. That's so desperately, I think, what we need in this hour. So thank you very much.
Before Jeff comes up to lead the Q&A session, I just want to mention that Joseph Gerson has handed me a note that he has some literature about Trump's testing threats, about the U.S.-China relation, and about common security in the Indo-Pacific region. Those are for sale, and see Joseph afterwards?
The articles are for free, the Pacific Report is $10.
Okay, so one of them is $10, but the rest of them are free. So go to Joseph if you want to look at that afterwards. And Jeff, come on up and lead the Q&A session.
You all have been very patient. We want to get everyone out while there is still sunlight, but I am sure that there will be questions after Reverend Wes's very dynamic and insightful presentation. So who wants to lead off a question? Yes, sir, and I would ask if when you stand up, you give your name so that the Reverend can, and also speak loudly, but also he can respond to you by name. So.
Poison Vanderwall, Presbyterian Church locally. I've
From-
heard it
from
cross.
where?
Poison Vanderwall.
Yeah, from
Presbyterian Church.
Presbyterian Church. I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Thanks.
I've heard that Carl Sagan's videos and presentation on nuclear winter were very effective in making the world aware of the danger of nuclear annihilation. Would something like that help to rejuvenate the awareness of the dangers we have? Again, and how would we do that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think at various points in time, media things have had a big effect. There was a famous movie that came out during the time of the nuclear freeze. What? The day after. And I'm told that even President Reagan viewed it. And historians, I guess, will say that, yeah, that actually brought things to awareness in a powerful way. You know, I don't know whether the House of Dynamite, what effect that's going to have. I think people are still wondering about that. I hope it does. I think that public consciousness changes in a variety of ways, but sometimes powerful visual movies or documentary or instance or sometimes the portrayal of direct action I mean, look at the way people are reacting to some of the scenes we've seen about those whom Joseph described as Gestapo tactics or arresting immigrants. Those have probably had more effect on concern about Trump's immigration policies than a lot of the papers and studies and reports. So, yes, sometimes visual, powerful movies or reports or images do have a powerful effect, and frankly, I think that's even more so now in our culture, because for reasons that I think have some other dangers, we are so geared to looking at our screens, driven by algorithms that push us to the dramatic and push us to things that startle us, because these algorithms are trying to make money for their sponsors. So that would be my answer.
Thank you, sir.
I'm Sanaullah from Pakistan. Thank you for the optimism, and thank you for the introspective approach, and thank you for putting the spirit back in the generations. My most concern when it comes to nuclear weapon is not Russia, USA, or China, but Pakistan itself. And being a youth, we are living in an era where those things which doesn't reflect a good human values are constitutionally implemented through a democratic process, which eroded the trust of new generation into the institution. And the separations from campus to community we experience on every day. So how do we can make ensure the non-violence success and optimism attached to it in the era where we can see that, like, I'm the victim of my professor. I spoke against, and I got C grade, just based on that.
Mhm.
So from campus to community, how can we make it sure? While, and currently I will highlight the current amendment in Pakistani constitutions with a 2/3 majority, which provide immunity to the military and further militarize the entire country with the nuclear weapons and its strategic in-depth that's going on in Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, while neighboring with Iran and Afghanistan, Taliban, other side. How can we, how can we make it possible?
I mean, I wish I had an answer. This is the situation being faced in so many places today as regimes become more authoritarian and follow this roadmap that's pretty clearly spelled out, that we see now reflected here and reflected in countries and what you vividly portray in your country of Pakistan. I think sometimes you have to act without really knowing what the results are going to be, because those things just are out of our control. And I'll give you an example. It comes from East Germany. During the time when the Berlin Wall was, well, before the Berlin Wall had fallen, and when changes were happening in the Soviet Union, and when the pressure on the communist bloc was greater than ever before, groups in East Germany in the Christian church, I mean, the Stasi controlled so much of East Germany, but they wouldn't really intervene much in congregations. It's the same kind of thing today about whether Trump will go into congregations to get immigrants. And so even though the East German church, you know, pastors had to report to Stasi agents and stuff like that, people could gather, and people started gathering in those churches and reading the Beatitudes and praying and just sort of saying, what happens now? And that grew, and it grew. And then they decided to have a candlelight march, and to have candlelight marches throughout East Germany. And this was at the same time when Yeltsin was coming into power. The changes were happening Gorbachev, and changes were happening politically, and there were all these pressures on the East German regime. Well, thousands of people in different locations throughout Germany, starting in Leipzig. I was there at the church a few years ago and to see this story firsthand. They went out to march. And how did they march? They marched with candles. And if you march with a candle, you have to hold the candle in one hand and protect it from the wind in the other hand, which means you can't have a weapon. Your candle's your only weapon. And the Stasi in police force had no way to know how to respond. And those marches continued. It became a movement. And historians, some of you here probably can investigate this. Historians will say those grassroots actions of marches that began spreading throughout Germany had one of the real effects on the final demise of the regime and the fall of the Berlin Wall. The people who started gathering in those churches at night, they didn't have a strategic plan. They just felt this is what we needed to do. And then the results happened in ways that were out of their control. There's one definition of prayer that I like. Maybe it is relevant to other traditions other than the Christian one, but it's this: prayer is detachment from the fruit of your actions. Prayer is detachment from the fruit of your actions. In other words, there are times when all you could do is offer all you know to the divine, and then not think that you're able to control all the outcomes, because more can happen than you even can imagine. That's about the best I could say.
Let's see, Karen Hernandez, and I should
Raven has had her hand up.
well, I'll get to Raven, I'll get to Raven. But Reverend Karen Hernandez Gratson, she pasterizes, whatever. She heads the Presbyterian congregation a block from where I grew up in Trenton. And she's, there you go.
Or if I did, I forgot. I just want to thank you for emphasizing the need for us to remember that we have to have a dependence on the divine, whatever name we have for the divine, for such a time as this. And a modern day mystic, for those of you that might not know, is Father Richard Rohr. And he spoke here in Princeton at St. Paul's Catholic Church just a few years ago. And he's retired, but he's accessible through a daily meditation. And the resources that he brings together to strengthen our spirit so we can do the work. He learned years ago, you can't be an activist if you don't have time for contemplation. Yeah. And so he brings resources, faith traditions together on that daily meditation, and people of color, members of the LGBTQIA. So I just encourage us to listen to what you've reminded us, that we need to balance our action with our spiritual disciplines.
Well, it's so good. Richard Rohr's a friend. He's also in New Mexico. I read the daily meditations every day. This morning he talked about the need for a whole new worldview that has to be at the root of what we do. And yes, he established the Center for Action and Contemplation, completely committed to all the action that we would talk about, and completely committed to providing the inner resources to make that possible.
Amen.
Okay, Raven, with your back up against the wall.
Thank you. Hi, Raven Witherspoon. A running theme not only in your remarks but also in Alex Bell's and Joseph's was this idea of dialogue, whether it was track 2 dialogues or getting to the table or loving my enemy.
Speak up, Raven.
Yes. The idea of dialogue. And so I was wondering if you and, I would open the floor to the other speakers as well, or maybe we can chat about it afterwards, but I would be curious to know if you could share a little bit more about why you see dialogue as so valuable, particularly how that value shifts in the good times and the bad times for those of us who have not been around for all of the ebbs and flows of the nuclear disarmament journey.
Well, I'll say a word, and if Joseph wants to add, fine. Look, I think in our time, dialogue across difference is so hard. I think it's really hard if any of us are honest. I mean, if you ask me, would you go out fishing for a day with an evangelical MAGA Trump Republican? I would just have to pray about it and say, can I equip myself for the discussion? Because I think these discussions are that hard today. Now, what helps and what have I known in my experience? I referenced briefly my ecumenical work. So within my own faith tradition, Christian community, we have these huge historical divisions between Catholic and Orthodox and Pentecostal and evangelical and Protestant, mainline Protestant. And these aren't just little doctrinal things. In history, they've been deadly. I mean, wars have been fought over these differences. And so I've worked for a long time in initiatives to try to bridge those gaps. What I've worked with in the last 25 years is something called the Global Christian Forum, which you can find online. The most helpful thing we found, and which we've written about and shared in other contexts, is that when you gather people together, you do not begin by talking about difference. You don't talk about doctrine. You don't talk about, okay, how are we going to resolve, in this case, what we think about communion or baptism or any of that. You gather people, and we've done this in global gatherings now 5 times. You gather people from these deep, different places, geographically, culturally, theologically, so forth. You know, a Catholic bishop from Italy with a Pentecostal pastor from Africa, and a whole around the table. And what you simply do is give each person the chance to share their story without any commentary. You know, take all the time you need just to tell your journey. And sometimes we've had these meetings, and that process alone has taken up most of the first day. When you finish that process, you've established a whole different way of relating and dialoguing. And I've seen similar things transferred to political context. And I don't know whether Alexandra or Joseph or others would also have experience. But it feels to me that to get, you know, you don't get across some of the divides we're presently facing in this political and cultural moment by arguing. The only way I know there's a chance to get through is by listening to one another's stories deeply, and then seeing how do we move from there.
Okay. Peter it is, right? Okay, and this is going to be our last question, and then Bob Moore will dismiss us.
Okay. Yeah.
Peter, you gotta stand up.
Stand up. Okay. I really appreciate your comments about the spiritual aspect of things. I know my life, that's been a big factor. So the government's not going to do anything good unless we force them to. Grassroots, we all agree with that. And then if the people aren't motivated, maybe it's partly because their values are not in gear. So it's very important for people to have the right values. And a lot of those values come from our spiritual life, that's what you're saying. Do you feel there's been a decline in spirituality in this country, at least in terms of the parts of the religious community that have been most involved with peacemaking, and that has been part of our problem?
Yeah, I mean, that is a huge question, and there are huge studies being done on that. I could summarize it this way. First, if you look generally at religious life participation in the United States, in general, it's going down. If you look at the Christian community, that's the case. The Christian community makes up such a large share of those who self-identify and participate. The studies have also been done of Muslim and Hindu and Buddhist communities in the United States. They show similar trends, but I'll focus on what is predominant in the Christian community. Now, you break that down and you find some differences. One is that there's more decline in white people than in people of color. You find a difference in participation, religious participation in communities of color. That alone, now it's not that historic black churches and others don't also face some real issues, but there's a difference in level of participation. The second thing is this: COVID had a huge effect on all institutions in the United States, including churches. There are probably about 350,000 congregations in the United States, as best people can estimate. And every single one of them was affected by COVID and had to figure out how did they go forward. If any of you are in worshiping congregations, you've done that. And what generally has happened is that the trends that were going on already were accelerated by COVID. It's simply sped everything up. Levels of participation pretty much across the board, and this is mainline Catholic, evangelical, have declined. But when you break it down, what you find is that a lot of people were going to church out of habit, and during COVID they couldn't, and then they said, what are we going to go back? I mean, you know, Those who do go back and now are intentionally involved in congregations have a higher level of commitment. You think about it, it kind of makes sense. I think we're moving towards a time when there'll be a lesser percentage of the population involved in worshiping congregations, but those that are there will have higher commitment. Then you look at the younger population. The younger demographic has lower levels of participation. One of the things that's driven them away, not in all cases, but because churches historically have had a very discriminatory attitude towards LGBTQ persons, for younger generations, that's just, that is an absolute starting point. And then the mingling of politics and church and what's happened, what they see happening within kind of the MAGA Trump movement also drives many people away from the church. Now, there's a thirst for levels of spirituality. And it's really important to understand, there's a lot of data about the nuns, meaning not Catholic nuns, but those who on a survey, what religious affiliation do you have? And they say none, N-O-N-E. And that's now at about 26%. But you examine them, and you find these people, only about 5 or 6 or 7% are agnostics or atheists. They just are removing themselves from the institution, from participating in the institutional church, but their levels of spiritual interest are high. Amen. So the spirituality in our culture, it comes out, you know, if you push it out in one way, it kind of pops up in other ways. It's all around, and there's a thirst for connecting a spiritual experience with action for good and for justice in the world. Amen. And so I think it's a really mixed picture, but in general, I think you can see there's going to be less participating. It's going to be some breakdown in terms of people of color, but there's going to be a higher level of any who participate, and they're going to want to be deeply involved in actions that make a difference. They're not, you know, they're going to want to belong before they believe. They want to be part of a community, and then they're not going to be there for reasons of doctrine. They're going to be reasons for community, especially amongst the younger demographic. I mean, I even read one story that was saying that Mondami in New York got 90,000 volunteers because a lot of these young people wanted to get up out of their living rooms with their phones and involved directly, and that they had some spiritual need. I mean, they wanted to make a difference. They want to have some meaning. Amen. So I think that's kind of where this is going. That's partly anecdotal, but there is a whole lot of research that's going into these various questions.